0514 hours, international waters, 90 nautical miles southwest of Key West, Florida. The contact that had been tracked on satellite monitoring for 6 hours is gone. Not lost, gone. The K-561 Kazan, a Yasin M-class nuclear attack submarine, 139 meters, 13,800 tons submerged displacement. Vertical launch cells loaded with Zircon hypersonic missiles, has dropped off every passive sensor in the region simultaneously. One moment the track was resolving, the next, nothing. The Caribbean, one of the most heavily monitored stretches of ocean adjacent to American territory, is showing a clean picture where a Russian nuclear submarine was operating minutes ago. At 90 nautical miles, a Zircon launch-to-impact timeline against targets on the Florida coast measures in minutes. The phrase adequate warning time loses its meaning at Mach 9. Northern Command elevated its alert posture within 4 minutes of the contact loss. The question was not whether the Kazan was still there, it was. The question was what it was doing, and the fact that it had chosen this moment to disappear from the picture rather than simply continuing its transit told experienced analysts everything they needed to know about the intent behind the approach. To understand why the Kazan's acoustic architecture makes this kind of disappearance possible, you need to step away from the conventional image of a submarine as a large metal object making noise underwater. The Yasin M represents the product of lessons Russian naval engineers drew from every decade of Cold War acoustic intelligence. The specific failure modes of every previous Soviet design that allowed Western hydrophone networks to track them with confidence. The Kazan's hull is lined with anechoic rubber tiles that absorb rather than reflect active sonar pulses. Its machinery is mounted on vibration-isolated rafts that decouple mechanical noise from the pressure hull. Its propulsion is optimized for quiet operation at patrol speeds that would be acoustically invisible to sensor generations one step behind the current technology. If an earlier Russian submarine was a motorcycle in a library, the Kazan is a person in socks crossing a carpeted floor in a room full of other noise. You can detect it, but the conditions have to be right, and you have to be looking in exactly the right place. The Russians added a layer of active deception on top of the passive acoustic signature management. The Gorshkov-class frigate Admiral Gorshkov and a support tugboat were transiting directly above the Kazan's position, their propellers, machinery, and hull flow noise creating a broadband acoustic ceiling that masked the submarine's residual signature from any hydrophone network looking upward through the water column. The surface ships were not there for their own mission. They were a mobile noise shield, a deliberate architectural choice to make the Kazan's presence acoustically ambiguous even to sensors that were specifically pointed at the right location. Moscow's message to Washington was calculated. They were not attempting to hide a transit. They were demonstrating that they could hold a weapons platform capable of striking American cities at distances that compress warning time to irrelevance, and that NATO's sensor architecture in the Caribbean was insufficient to prevent it. The first American response looked, from the Russian perspective, exactly like what Moscow wanted to see. USS Donald Cook, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, transited to the area with active radar operating and AIS transponder broadcasting. To anyone monitoring the electromagnetic environment, including the Kazan's passive sensors, this looked like a surface combatant making a visible declaratory show of presence. The kind of response a Navy makes when it is trying to signal concern but lacks the intelligence picture to do anything more precise. The Russian captain watched the Donald Cook's arrival on his sonar display and read it correctly as panic. He was reading exactly what Washington wanted him to read. The Donald Cook was not the response. It was the distraction that allowed the response to position itself undetected. At 3,000 feet above the surface, a P-8A Poseidon was executing an off-axis patrol pattern, flying a wide enough arc that its presence would not register as a direct acoustic hunt to the Kazan's electronic support measures. It was dropping passive sonobuoys in a grid pattern calibrated to the Kazan's projected maneuvering space. Each buoy, a passive acoustic receiver sitting quietly in the water, transmitting no signal that the submarine could detect, listening for everything. Below the layer at 400 feet, USS Helena, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, was already in position. The sonobuoy network's data was being relayed to her fire control system. She was not moving. She was listening, with her acoustic position carefully chosen to be in the noise shadow of the Donald Cook's transit, masked by the very surface presence that the Russian captain was treating as evidence of American confusion. The trap had been assembled around the Kazan before the Donald Cook arrived. The Donald Cook's job was to give the Russian captain a reason to feel confident while he walked into it. What the Russian captain felt was not the geometry of a trap. It was an opportunity. he ordered the release of an MG-74 self-propelled acoustic decoy, a device that emits a broadband noise signature replicating a Yasen-class submarine accelerating on an eastward heading. The decoy is not crude. It replicates not just the frequency content of the acoustic signature, but the Doppler shift and bearing change that a sonar operator would see from a submarine actually executing that maneuver. The Sonobuoy network lit up. The Donald Cook's sonar suite acquired the contact and began tracking it east. The Surface Fleet commanding officer, with a responsibility to protect the coastline and a contact that appeared to be a Russian nuclear submarine accelerating toward open water, made the reasonable decision and turned east to pursue. The acoustic perimeter that the P-8A had assembled tore open on the eastern side. Aboard the Helena, the sonar officer reported the same thing. Contact accelerating east, consistent with the target maneuvering to break contact. The entire American surface and air element was moving east. Protocol said follow. The captain said hold. He had been in submarines long enough to know what a perfectly executed decoy maneuver looks like. It looks exactly like what was on the screen. The Helena sat still in the darkness with a question that had no comfortable answer. If the decoy was real, the Kazan was escaping, and he would be the officer who let a nuclear-armed Russian submarine slip past American defenses 90 miles from Florida. If the decoy was a decoy, the Kazan was still somewhere in the original contact area, and the Helena's stillness was the only thing positioned to catch it. The Helena's computer, no longer tracking its own movement through the water, began filtering out the noise baseline that had been present since before the operation started, including the specific acoustic profile of the Gorshkov's propulsion above. As that profile was classified as background and subtracted from the picture, the residual acoustic environment became cleaner. Not by much, just enough. The Kazan had used the moment when the American surface fleet was committed eastward to separate from the Gorshkov's acoustic shadow and make its own move, west toward the Gulf Stream. The separation from the noise shield was brief. The Helena's sonar operator caught it. A contact break, directional, westward. At the moment, the Gorshkov's masking geometry changed. Contact separation, target breaking west. The Gulf Stream is one of the loudest natural features in the Atlantic, a river of warm water moving at 2 to 3 knots, carrying biological noise, internal wave turbulence, and flow disturbance that creates a broadband acoustic environment that passive sonar operators describe as trying to listen for a whisper inside a waterfall. The Kazan shut its main propulsion down and drifted into the current, carried at walking pace its residual noise below the Gulf Stream's noise floor. The Helena deployed her towed array, 9,000 meters of acoustic cable streaming astern, the low-frequency receiving system that provides the sensitivity needed to detect the faintest mechanical signatures at long range. Deploying it meant reducing speed to near zero to prevent cable stress. The most capable acoustic hunter in the American inventory had just converted itself into a near-stationary platform that could hear farther but could not maneuver quickly. The towed array resolved a faint transient to the west. The Helena began a careful approach. Which would you hold at this moment? Continue the slow towed array approach and accept the risk of the Kazan hearing you before you hear it clearly, or retrieve the array and close at speed and accept the risk of going partially deaf. There is no good answer. Tell us what you would choose below. The Kazan's passive sonar detected the pressure change in the water ahead of it, the bow wave signature of a submarine approaching even at slow speed. The Russian captain recognized what it meant. He flooded the ballast tanks, driving the submarine below the thermocline, the boundary between warm surface water and the cold deep layer that acts as an acoustic mirror, bending sound waves upward rather than allowing them to penetrate deeper. For a submarine below the thermocline, a passive sonar above it hears a reflection of its own noise rather than the submarine's signature. The Helena's sonar screen went dark. She was now trailing a towed array she could not move quickly, hovering above a thermal boundary she could not see through, with a nuclear-armed submarine somewhere below her that was no longer acoustically visible. The captain ordered the towed array retrieved. He ordered the diving planes down 15 degrees. The Helena crossed the thermocline. For the seconds of the crossing, the sound environment outside the hull was a violent refracted chaos, the acoustic equivalent of forcing your eyes open in turbulent water. The sonar suite was effectively blind. The hull groaned against the pressure differential between water layers. Every person in the command compartment understood that they were diving blind into the space where the Kazan was waiting, and that the Kazan knew someone was coming. The bow cleared the cold layer. The sonar display resolved. The Kazan was 2,000 yards ahead. motionless, waiting in ambush for whoever came through the thermocline. 2,000 yards in submarine warfare is not a safe distance. It is a fire control solution. Both crews knew it simultaneously. The Kazan's captain had made the assumption that no American submarine would risk a blind thermocline crossing against an armed adversary. He had positioned himself to ambush the approach from above. When the Helena's hull appeared on his sonar display, already below the layer and already at 2,000 yards, the tactical assumption that had governed his positioning for the past 40 minutes became a liability. He turned to face the Helena directly, the standard defensive posture that presents the smallest acoustic profile and keeps the torpedo tube geometry pointed at the threat. Helena's weapons officer locked a firing solution. The Kazan's weapons officer locked a firing solution. Two submarines, combined mass approaching 30,000 tons, facing each other in the dark at a range where the engagement outcome was not a question of whether missiles hit. At 2,000 yards, both torpedoes would hit, but of who fired first and whether first mattered when the closing time of a Mk-48 ADCAP at 55 knots covers 2,000 yards in under 65 seconds. The darkness held. Neither captain fired. One ping came from the Russian side. A single active sonar pulse at low power. Not a targeting emission, not a ranging shot for a weapons solution. In the acoustic vocabulary that submariners on both sides of the Cold War developed over decades of close-quarters encounters, a single low-power ping at this range means one thing. I see you. You see me. We are done here. The Kazan closed its torpedo tube outer doors. Slowly. The sound of that closure was recorded on the Helena's sonar and would be analyzed for hours afterward. Air entered the Russian submarine's ballast tanks. The Kazan rose through the thermocline, through the Gulf Stream, through the Caribbean, and broke the surface. It transited to Havana under its own power, where it docked and was met by the Cuban government with the ceremony Moscow had arranged. Russian state media covered the arrival as a display of strategic reach, proof that the Russian Navy could operate at will in waters America considers its exclusive sphere of influence. The Helena did not surface. She went deep and resumed her patrol. Here is what the Russian state media coverage did not include. During the seconds when the Kazan switched to active fire control mode, flooding its targeting system, cycling its weapons to ready status, every emission that crossed into the water column was captured by the Helena's acoustic suite and the sonobuoy network still operating in the area. The specific frequency parameters of the Kazan's fire control sonar, the acoustic signature of the torpedo tube flooding sequence. The electronic support measure emissions the Kazan's passive sensors generated as they swept for threats. The timing and pattern of the ballast tank venting that preceded the surfacing. Every piece of that data is now in the U.S. Navy's Acoustic Intelligence Library, permanently associated with hull number K561. The Kazan will never again be able to operate in any ocean where American sensors are present without being recognizable by the specific mechanical fingerprint it broadcasts during those contact moments. Future P-8. A crews will know exactly what they are looking for. Future fast attack submarines will know exactly what the Kazan sounds like when it is preparing to engage. Moscow brought its most capable submarine to Florida's doorstep to demonstrate that American waters were not safe from Russian reach. The demonstration succeeded tactically. The Kazan operated within striking distance of American territory and returned to port undamaged. What it also did was provide the most comprehensive acoustic characterization of a Yasen M-class submarine that American intelligence had ever collected under live operational conditions. Russia paid for one propaganda photograph in Havana Harbor with the permanent acoustic fingerprint of its most advanced submarine. The outcome of the confrontation itself was a draw on points. The intelligence outcome was not. The question that follows is one that Russian submarine commanders will be working through in their operational planning for years. If American doctrine now includes thermocline crossing approaches that accept temporary acoustic blindness in exchange for positional advantage below the layer, the defensive assumption that the thermocline provides a safe hiding position has been invalidated. What is the next architectural choice available to a submarine trying to hold a protected position in deep water against an adversary willing to follow it through the layer? And if that position does not exist, if every acoustic shelter has a geometry that can be exploited given enough patience and the right sensor platform, what does sustained nuclear deterrence posture look like in a Caribbean that the U.S. Navy has demonstrated it can cover at depth? Leave your analysis below.